The radar operator at RAF Saxe-Voord, perched on the northern tip of the Shetlands, leaned closer to his scope. It was a grey morning in the spring of 1970, and the North Sea below was the colour of gunmetal. A blip had appeared at the very edge of his coverage, far out over international waters near the Norwegian coast. It was big, it was fast, and it was flying straight along the seam between east and west, the invisible frontier where NATO's patience ended and the Soviet Northern Fleet's ambitions began. He picked up the line to the Sector Operations Center. Within 90 seconds, 2 Lightnings of No. 11 Squadron were scrambling from Lochars in Fife, afterburners howling, climbing through the cloud at a rate that would press a grown man into his seat until his vision greyed at the edges. What happened over the next 11 minutes off the Norwegian coast would be photographed, filmed, measured, and dissected, not just by the British. The interception was watched, recorded, and then studied by analysts in Moscow, poring over the gun camera footage and the radar plots for years afterward. They wanted to understand precisely how the Royal Air Force did what it did, how a British interceptor scrambled from a cold airfield in Scotland could find, close on, and shadow one of the most secret aircraft in the Soviet inventory before it had even reached its target. Because this was not a routine shepherding of a lumbering Soviet bomber. This was something the men at Fighter Command had been waiting for. And when the Lightning's pilot eased alongside the intruder and looked across the gap, what he saw made his throat go dry. We tend to remember the Cold War as a thing of summits and submarines, of Berlin and Cuba, of grand confrontations between Washington and Moscow. But there was another war, quieter, colder, fought every single day in the freezing air corridors above the North Atlantic and the Norwegian Sea. Britain stood at the very centre of it. The United Kingdom was the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the forward edge of NATO's air defence, the place where Soviet intentions were tested and Soviet aircraft probed for weakness, week after week, year after year. And the men who flew the Lightning, that beautiful, brutal, fuel-starved rocket of an aeroplane, were the ones who met them. They flew an interceptor that could outclimb almost anything in the sky, and yet could barely stay airborne long enough to do its job. They operated on the knife edge between triumph and disaster on every single sortie. This is the story of one of those interceptions. A single engagement off the coast of Norway that, on the surface, looked like dozens of others. The kind of thing that filled a line in a squadron logbook and was forgotten by lunchtime. Except this one wasn't forgotten. This one travelled east into the filing cabinets of Soviet air defense research, where it was examined again and again as analysts tried to work out what the British had learned about them, and how much trouble they were really in. To understand why one quiet morning over the Norwegian Sea mattered so much, we have to understand the world that produced it. A world in which Britain, shorn of its empire and short of money, still insisted on standing in the front rank. A world in which a handful of squadrons in eastern Scotland held a line that stretched from the Faroes to the Arctic Circle. And a world in which a single photograph taken from the cockpit of a British fighter could shift the calculations of the Kremlin. So how did Britain end up flying the thin blue line at the top of the world? And what exactly did that Lightning pilot see? By 1970, Britain was a nation living beyond its means and refusing to admit it. The empire was all but gone. India had departed in 1947, the African colonies through the late 50s and 60s, and only a scattering of dependencies remained. The economic miracle that had rebuilt West Germany and Japan had largely passed Britain by, and successive governments, Macmillans, Wilsons, soon Heaths, wrestled with sterling crises, balance of payments deficits, and the slow, painful adjustment to being a medium-sized power rather than a global one. And yet, in the realm of defence, Britain still behaved like a great power because the alternative was unthinkable. The 1968 decision to withdraw from east of Suez had been a genuine watershed. Harold Wilson's government conceding that the United Kingdom could no longer afford a worldwide military presence. The retreat from Singapore, the Gulf, and the Far East was a quiet humiliation dressed up as rational planning. But one commitment was never on the table for reduction: the defence of the British Isles themselves and of the North Atlantic approaches. This was the bargain at the heart of NATO. The Americans provided the nuclear umbrella and the bulk of the conventional muscle. The West Germans held the central front. And the British? Britain held the sea and the air of the North Atlantic, the lifeline along which American reinforcements and supplies would have to travel if the Cold War ever turned hot. Without those sea lanes, NATO's European armies would wither, and the gateway to those sea lanes ran through the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, the GAUK gap, as the planners called it. The chiefs of staff in Whitehall understood the geography perfectly. The Soviet Northern Fleet, based around Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula, was growing into the most powerful naval force the Russians had ever assembled. Its submarines, surface ships, and long-range aircraft would, in any war, surge out into the Atlantic to sever the link between America and Europe. To do it, they had to pass Britain's doorstep. And so, the United Kingdom became, in the cold language of the planners, the cork in the bottle, the forward bastion whose air defences would meet the first Soviet probes and, in war, the first Soviet bombers. For the airmen of Fighter Command, formally absorbed into Strike Command in 1968, though the old culture endured, this meant a permanent state of readiness that never relaxed, not for a single day, in decades. Soviet aircraft tested the line constantly. Long-range maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft, above all the great turboprop Bears, would fly down from the Kola bases, skirting Norwegian airspace, probing the timing and competence of the British response, gathering electronic intelligence on radar and communications. Every one of these incursions had to be met. Not because a single reconnaissance flight threatened Britain, but because failing to meet it would tell Moscow that the line could be crossed. Deterrence is a matter of demonstration. If the Royal Air Force could be relied upon to find and intercept every intruder swiftly and professionally in all weathers, then the Soviets would have to assume that in war their bombers would be met just as efficiently, and that the cost of attacking would be ruinous. This was the strategic logic that kept young men sitting in cockpits at the end of Scottish runways in the small hours, in the freezing dark, waiting for the scramble bell. It was a war without battles, measured in interceptions rather than victories. And the aircraft they flew to fight it was unlike anything before or since. A machine that defined an era of British air defence, and very nearly killed the men who flew it as often as the enemy might have. To understand the interception off Norway, we must understand that aeroplane and the men who strapped themselves into it. The English Electric Lightning was the only all-British supersonic fighter ever to enter frontline service, and it was magnificent and maddening in equal measure. Designed in the 1950s, entering squadron service in 1960, it was built around a single, uncompromising idea: get up, get there, and get the enemy bomber before it could release its weapons. To that end, its designers had stacked two Rolls-Royce Avon engines one atop the other and bolted them to the smallest practical airframe. The result could climb to 36,000 feet in under 3 minutes and exceed twice the speed of sound. But that performance came at a brutal price. Fuel, or rather the lack of it. The Lightning drank kerosene at a terrifying rate, and its internal tanks were small. A typical sortie might give a pilot only the briefest window over his target before the fuel gauges forced him home. Pilots joked grimly that the Lightning was the only aircraft that could be refueled in flight and still run out of fuel. It demanded immaculate planning, perfect ground control, and nerves of iron. Fly it well, and it was the finest pure interceptor in the world. Fly it carelessly, and the North Sea was waiting. The men who flew it from Leuchars and Binbrook were a particular breed. Many had cut their teeth on hunters and javelins. Some were old enough to remember the war. They lived a curious double life. Ordinary married men in Scottish or Lincolnshire villages one moment, and the next, sitting quick reaction alert. Q, in a hut beside the runway, fully kitted, the aircraft armed and fueled outside, waiting for the telebrief to crackle into life. From the bell to becoming airborne, the target was under 10 minutes. Often they beat it comfortably. Their adversary, on the days that mattered, was usually the Tupolev Tu-95, the aircraft NATO christened the Bear. It was a giant. 4 enormous turboprop engines driving contra-rotating propellers whose tips spun supersonically, producing a roar so loud it could be detected by sonar underwater. The Bear could fly for thousands of miles, loitering off the British and Norwegian coasts, photographing NATO ships, recording radar emissions, and announcing by its very presence that the Soviet Union could reach out and touch the West whenever it chose. But the Soviets flew other things too, and it was the rarer, stranger intruders that set pulses racing at the operations centers. Reconnaissance variants bristling with antennae, new types whose performance was unknown. Aircraft that British intelligence, the Joint Intelligence Committee, the analysts at GCHQ, the air staff in the Ministry of Defence, desperately wanted photographed, measured, and understood. Every interception was an intelligence opportunity. A clear gun camera shot of a new Soviet aircraft, its antennae, its markings, its weapons pylons, was worth more than any number of agents' reports. This was the quiet truth behind the romance of the scramble. The interception was not merely about turning the intruder away. It was about gathering intelligence and about denying the Soviets intelligence in return. Each side was reading the other constantly. The Soviets wanted to know how fast Britain reacted, on what frequencies, with what aircraft, guided by which radars. The British wanted to know what the Soviets were flying, how it performed, and what it could carry. So when, on that grey morning off Norway, the radar at Saxe-Vord caught something that did not fit the usual pattern, something flying higher and faster than a bear, something the controllers could not immediately identify. The response was instant, and the stakes were higher than usual. 2 lightnings were already rolling. The intelligence men would want everything: photographs, plots, every scrap of electronic data. And the pilot leading that pair was about to get closer to a secret Soviet aircraft than almost any Western airman had managed before. Closer, perhaps, than the Soviets ever intended. The scramble itself was a thing of ruthless choreography. The moment the order came down the telebrief, the 2 pilots ran for their aircraft, were strapped in by their ground crews in seconds, and lit their engines almost before the chocks were clear. Within 2 minutes of the bell, both lightnings were thundering down the Leuchars runway and rotating into the murk. The ground controller's voice was already in their ears, vectoring them north and east, out over the cold sea, climbing hard. This was the part the Soviets could never quite replicate in their training estimates: the sheer speed and smoothness of the British reaction. Their analysts assumed a certain reaction time, a certain climb profile, a certain interception geometry. What the radar plots from this particular morning would later show them was a response faster and more precise than their models predicted. That alone was worth studying. If the British could react this quickly to a peacetime probe, what would they do to a wartime raid? The lead pilot leveled at altitude and let the controller work. Ground-controlled interception was a partnership. The man on the ground had the big picture from the radar. The man in the cockpit had the eyes and the weapons. The controller fed him headings and ranges, closing the geometry until the moment the pilot's own radar, the Lightning's AI .23, could lock the target. A small green return bloomed on the scope. Contact. The target was where the controller said it would be, and it was fast. Now came the discipline that defined the Lightning pilot's art. He had fuel for only so long at this speed and altitude. Every second of afterburner was a second subtracted from his time over the target and his margin to get home. He had to close decisively, identify quickly, and not waste a drop. The North Sea below offered nothing but death to a man who miscalculated. As the range came down, the controller's tone changed. The target was not behaving like a routine bear plodding along its usual track. It was higher, it was faster, and the electronic warfare operators monitoring from the ground were picking up emissions that did not match the familiar signatures. Whatever this was, it was not the usual visitor. Word would already be flashing back through the reporting chain. To Strike Command, to the Ministry of Defense, to the intelligence analysts who lived for exactly this. The pilot eased back his throttles, trading speed for fuel, and began the delicate business of converting a head-on radar contact into a stern conversion, coming round behind and below the target where he could shadow it, photograph it, and identify it without alarming its crew into a sudden maneuver. This was flying of the highest order. A closing speed of hundreds of knots, a target he could not yet see, a fuel state that allowed no second attempts, and the knowledge that the men back home wanted everything he could give them. Then, breaking out of a thin layer of cloud, he saw it. A dark shape ahead, and slightly above, trailing 4 lines of exhaust haze. Big, sleek, unmistakably Soviet, and unmistakably not the aircraft anyone had expected. His gun camera was already running. He pressed in closer, the grey sea sliding past far below, and began to read the details a generation of intelligence officers had been waiting for. The antenna, the configuration, the markings. And then the Soviet aircraft did something that turned a routine intelligence interception into the engagement that Moscow would study for years. It reacted to him, not by fleeing, but by maneuvering in a way that revealed exactly what kind of aircraft it was and exactly what it was trying to protect. The Lightning pilot, watching through his visor with his camera whirring, suddenly understood that he had stumbled onto something the Soviets had badly not wanted the West to see. What was it? And why did it matter so much? For the next several minutes, in the freezing air off the Norwegian coast, 2 aircraft from opposite sides of the Iron Curtain flew a strange, silent ballet. The Lightning sat off the Soviet machine's quarter, close enough now for the British pilot to see the rivets, the weathering on the metal, the faces, pale ovals, of the crew turning to look back at him through their own canopy and ports. He had his identification. This was no ordinary bear on a milk run. The configuration, the additional fairings and blisters along the fuselage, the forest of antennae, all told the story. This was a specialized reconnaissance and electronic intelligence variant, packed with the sensors the Soviets used to map NATO's radar and communications. In wartime, an aircraft like this would be the eyes of a strike, locating the fleet, plotting the defenses, opening the door for the bombers and missiles that would follow. To photograph it in detail, at close range, was a genuine intelligence coup. But it was what the aircraft did next that mattered most. As the Lightning settled into its shadowing position, the Soviet pilot began to maneuver, adjusting heading, altering altitude, turning in ways that were not random. He was trying to keep certain parts of his aircraft away from the British camera. He was protecting something. And in doing so, he told the watching pilot, and the analysts who would later study the footage, precisely which equipment the Soviets considered most secret. The very act of concealment was a disclosure. The British pilot stayed with him, calmly, professionally, matching each turn, keeping his camera trained on exactly the things the Soviet was trying to hide. This is the cold artistry of the intelligence interception. The intruder reveals his priorities by what he tries to protect, and a disciplined airman exploits that, frame by frame, without a shot being fired. The Lightning's guns were armed. They were never needed. The weapon that mattered that morning was the camera. All the while, the fuel gauges were unwinding. The lead pilot was acutely aware that every second alongside the Soviet aircraft was a second eating into his margin home. The Lightning's curse hung over the whole encounter. His wingman, holding off at a distance, was watching the same gauges with the same anxiety. There would come a hard moment, a bingo fuel call, when both men would have to break off, regardless of how valuable the contact, and turn for Scotland, climbing to height to stretch every remaining pound of kerosene into distance. But before that moment came, the lead pilot got what he had come for. He drew almost level, holding formation with the great Soviet machine as if they were members of the same display team, and looked across the narrow gap of freezing air at an aeroplane that, a few minutes earlier, had been a mystery. He saw the Soviet crew clearly now. One of them raised a hand, not in threat, but in the strange, grudging courtesy that sometimes passed between airmen who understood that they were that day merely doing their jobs. Then the Lightning pilot rocked his wings, peeled away, and the gun camera captured the whole length of the Soviet fuselage as he banked clear. The controller's voice came up in his ears. Time to come home. Fuel state critical. Fuel. He acknowledged, lit his afterburners for one last surge to altitude, and turned southwest for the Scottish coast, his wingman tucking in behind. Behind them, the Soviet aircraft droned on along its track, its crew no doubt already composing the report that would travel back to the Kola Peninsula, and from there into the Soviet Air Defense Research Establishment. For the British, it had been a textbook interception, professionally flown, brilliantly controlled, and richly rewarded with intelligence. The film in the Lightning's camera would be developed, scrutinized, and circulated to the analysts who hungered for exactly this kind of material. But what neither pilot fully grasped as they hauled their thirsty aircraft back towards Luchas was how seriously the other side would take what had just happened. There was, on the British side, no cost in blood that morning. Both Lightnings landed safely, fuel state perilous, but sufficient, ground crews waiting, the gun camera film handed over for processing within the hour. By the standards of the Cold War's air war, it was an unqualified success, but the encounter exposed costs and vulnerabilities of a subtler kind, the chronic strains beneath Britain's proud forward posture. The first was the aircraft itself. The Lightning's appalling fuel endurance was not a quirk to be laughed off. It was a strategic liability. Time and again, interceptions had to be cut short at the very moment they became most valuable, because the fighter simply could not stay airborne. Pilots were lost over the years, to fuel exhaustion, to fire, to the unforgiving sea, flying an aircraft that punished the smallest error with death. The Lightning's accident record was sobering. Every successful interception was shadowed by the knowledge of those who had not made it home, who had ejected into a North Sea that gave a man minutes, at best, before the cold killed him. Britain was holding the line with a magnificent aircraft that was, in truth, running on the edge of its capabilities every single day. The second cost was financial and political. Britain was straining to maintain a frontline air defence on a shrinking budget, in a decade of devaluation and cuts. Every squadron at readiness, every hour of flying, every gallon of that precious kerosene had to be wrung from a treasury that was forever looking for savings. The men in Whitehall who set defence policy, the chiefs of staff, the defence secretary, ultimately the cabinet, were performing a permanent balancing act between commitment and capability. The interceptions had to continue because deterrence demanded them, but the resources to sustain them were always under threat. Britain was writing cheques with its air defence that its economy could barely honour. And there was a third, quieter cost, the relentless psychological burden on the men who flew the line. Quick reaction. Alert never stopped. Christmas, New Year, the small hours of a freezing February morning. The Soviets came when they came, and the Lightnings went up to meet them. The pilots lived with the permanent possibility of the scramble, the permanent knowledge that each sortie over that grey sea might be their last. It was a war without the catharsis of battle, an endless vigil rewarded not with victory, but with the mere absence of disaster. What did Britain learn? A great deal. The gun camera film and electronic data from interceptions like this one fed directly into the national intelligence picture. By documenting the new Soviet reconnaissance and electronic intelligence aircraft, the analysts could build up a detailed understanding of how the Northern Fleet intended to fight, how it would find NATO's ships, how it would map NATO's defences, how it would prepare the battlefield of the North Atlantic. Each frame of film was a piece of the puzzle. The Joint Intelligence Committee and the Air Staff used such material to refine assessments that shape procurement, tactics, and the eventual case for the Lightning's successors. For the lesson of the fuel-starved Lightning was already being learned. Britain needed an interceptor that could loiter, that could stay on station for hours rather than minutes, that could meet the bears far out over the gap, and shadow them for as long as required. The hard experience of those marginal, fuel-critical interceptions made the argument, in pounds and in lives, for a different kind of aircraft, one that would, in time, transform Britain's ability to hold the Northern Line. But the most striking cost of all was borne not by Britain, but by the Soviet Union, and it was a cost in confidence. Because somewhere in Moscow, the report and the data from that interception landed on the desks of men whose job it was to worry about exactly one thing. How good were the British, really? And what they concluded would echo for years. It is one of the quiet ironies of the Cold War that the side which learned most from this interception may not have been the British at all. For while the gun camera film was developed at an RAF station and filed away in the British intelligence system, the Soviet cruise report travelled east. And there it set off a process of analysis out of all proportion to the 11 minutes it described. To understand why, you have to understand the Soviet military mind. Soviet air defense and naval aviation were institutions built on doctrine, on careful study, on the accumulation of data about the enemy. When one of their valuable, secret reconnaissance aircraft was intercepted so swiftly, identified so precisely, and shadowed so closely by a single British fighter scrambled from a cold airfield hundreds of miles away, it raised a question that gnawed at the planners. If the British could do this in peacetime to one aircraft on a routine flight, What did it mean for the survivability of Soviet aviation over the North Atlantic in a real war? The interception became, in effect, a data point in a much larger Soviet assessment of NATO's northern air defences, and specifically of the British contribution to them. Soviet analysts pored over the geometry of the interception, the speed of the reaction, the climb performance, the closing angles, the discipline of the shadowing. They wanted to know how the British had done it, what it revealed about British radar coverage and ground control, and what it meant for their own planning. The very efficiency of the interception was unsettling. It suggested that the GI-UK gap was watched far more closely and defended far more competently than a glance at Britain's economic decline might suggest. This was deterrence working exactly as the planners in Whitehall intended. Britain could no longer match the superpowers in sheer mass, but it could be relentlessly, demonstrably competent. Every clean interception sent a message to Moscow that the northern approaches were not a soft option, that Soviet aircraft would be found and met, and that any wartime surge into the Atlantic would be contested from the very first mile. The cumulative effect of thousands of such interceptions year upon year was to plant in the Soviet mind a healthy respect for British air defence, a respect that shaped Soviet caution. In the broader sweep of Cold War strategy, this fitted the role Britain had carved out for itself. Unable to afford a global posture, the United Kingdom concentrated its dwindling resources on the tasks that mattered most to the alliance: anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic, the nuclear deterrent carried by the Royal Navy's submarines, and the air defence of the northern approaches. In each, Britain aimed not for quantity, but for a quality that made it indispensable to Washington and respected in Moscow. The interception off Norway was a single thread in that larger fabric, but a revealing one. There were consequences, too, for the aircraft. The hard lessons of the lightning years, the fuel crisis, the marginal interceptions, the lost pilots, strengthened the case for a long endurance interceptor capable of meeting intruders far out and holding them for hours. In time, that requirement would be answered, and Britain's ability to police the Northern Line would be transformed. The Lightning, for all its glory, was a thoroughbred sprinter in a contest that increasingly demanded a marathon runner. And the special relationship was quietly served as well. British interception and intelligence work in the North contributed directly to the shared NATO picture, reinforcing Britain's value to the Americans not as a junior partner to be tolerated, but as the indispensable guardian of the Atlantic's gateway. In the unglamorous, grinding routine of the QRA scramble, Britain bought itself a seat at the table. But what does this single morning off Norway really tell us, looking back across half a century? Strip away the romance of the lightning and the drama of the scramble, and what remains is a profound truth about Britain in the second half of the 20th century. This was a nation that had lost an empire and not yet found a comfortable role, struggling with its finances, its identity, and its place in a world dominated by two superpowers. And yet, in the cold air above the North Atlantic, Britain found a way to matter, not through mass, not through wealth, but through sheer, unrelenting professional excellence. The interception off Norway was, in itself, a small thing. 11 minutes, no shots fired, a few rolls of gun camera film. By the next morning, the squadron had moved on to the next sortie, the next scramble, the next grey dawn over the sea. But it stands as a perfect miniature of the whole British Cold War experience. A handful of squadrons flying a difficult and dangerous aircraft, holding a line that stretched to the Arctic, met the Soviet Union day after day with a competence that the other side could neither match nor ignore. And in the filing cabinets of Moscow, the evidence of that competence accumulated, shaping Soviet calculations in ways the men who flew the line never saw. There is a lesson here that reaches well beyond the Cold War. Power is not only a matter of size. A nation that knows precisely what it must do, and does it superbly, can punch far above its weight and earn a respect that wealth alone cannot buy. Britain, in the post-war decades, made a virtue of focus. It chose the tasks that mattered: the deterrent, the Atlantic, the northern approaches, and pursued them with a quiet excellence that kept it relevant in a world that might easily have written it off. The Lightning pilots sitting QRA in their freezing huts were, whether they knew it or not, the human expression of a national strategy. And there is poignancy in it, too. Those men flew an aircraft that asked everything of them and gave little margin for error. Some did not come home. They are not commemorated by great battles or famous victories because the war they fought produced neither. Their triumph was that nothing happened, that the bombers never came, that the deterrent held, that the line was never broken. It is the strangest kind of heroism, the heroism of the vigil, of the empty sky, of the war that was won precisely because it was never fought. So the next time you picture the Cold War, look past the summits and the spies and the missiles on parade. Picture, instead, a grey morning over the Norwegian Sea, a British fighter sliding alongside a Soviet aircraft, a gun camera whirring, and two crews regarding each other across a narrow gap of freezing air. In that quiet, deadly courtesy lay the real shape of the contest, and Britain's particular genius for finding a way to count. That is the story of how one lightning interception off Norway came to be studied in Moscow for years. If you found it as compelling as I did, do give this video a like. It genuinely helps the channel reach more fellow history enthusiasts. Subscribe for more deep dives into Britain's hidden Cold War and ring the bell so you never miss one. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Britain's strategy of quality over quantity was a stroke of genius or simply making the best of decline? Tell me below, and I'll see you in the next one.